Welcome to the Cage Corner podcast, a podcast journey through the filmography of Nicolas Cage. My name is Captain Nostalgia, and I will be your captain for this wild and crazy ride that is the career of Mr. Cage. And if you guys are new to our show works just a little bit differently than other Nicolas Cage podcasts that are out there. First off, this is a spin-off podcast from Victims and Villains, a podcast which educates and engages listeners on mental health awareness and suicide prevention through the lens of various pop culture topics. Secondly, every film that we cover on here are films that are supported by the Victims and Villains Patreon at our $5 tier, which our Patreon is all set up so that we can not only give you guys access to exclusive content you can't get anywhere else, but it also helps us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, churches, and more. And 3, I am joined each month by a different member of our writing staff and alumni staff as well. And I am joined this week by Mr. Micah Kimber to talk about the documentary, The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened.
Tim and I were pretty far down the road designing it, and I know with Tim and where I was going to go, we would have done something really special. But the truth, but at least it's out there in the ether that could have happened, but it doesn't have to. We don't have to make the movie. It's still interesting.
Are you aware of the Kickstarter campaign to kind of dive deeper into Superman Lives as a documentary?
I do think that I had the win-win situation because, you know, that character is such a bullseye that you have to hit. You know, he's one of the most precious icons of our country. At least it's out there in the ether that could have happened.
Yo, all right. So, man, it's so much. And it's kind of weird to talk about a documentary because documentaries are never was. So it's just like a really kind of meta, like super far removed sort of topic. But it is... I don't know what word to use because obviously, like, the movie never happened, so I want to be like, it is amazing, but it's like, well, it's a documentary about a movie that had a lot of facets and moving parts, and it was a very fun watch. It was, documentaries aren't supposed to be funny, but as a nerd, as a Nicolas Cage fan as well, it's like, oh my gosh, this would have been, I don't even know. Like, there are just so many things that were just, like, laughable in a good way, laughable in a like facepalm sort of way. I don't know, like, yeah, it was just it was a fun watch, and we're gonna get into it. Josh, what'd you think?
So I hunted down this Blu-ray because
you needed a documentary on Blu-ray.
Look, at the time when it came out, like, the only way that you could watch it was on Blu-ray.
Wild, okay.
And so, like, now it's been streamed on, like, Showtime, and, like, you can watch the full thing on YouTube, I believe.
Sure.
And the director, jon-schnepp, who's no longer with us, was at New York Comic Con, and I was such a fan of his podcast, and he talked about it all the time on Collider Movie Talk about how he was creating this documentary, and I was like, I don't know what this is, but I want it. And it was the first time in a long time that I just ever went out and, like, blind bought this DVD. And the first thing I did, I hadn't seen my wife in like 3 or 4 days. And so, you know, like, being away from your significant other, they were like, you know, hey, tell me about the convention, tell me about what happened. Sure. Like, and I'm like, I'm sorry, right now, I don't want anything to do with you. I just want, this is one of only 2 documentaries I own in my pretty impressive film collection. But I love the ideas and the concepts that this film brings about from its very different film, like, screenwriters that we'll get into.
Yeah.
This crazy cast that they had, the concept art, just everything that they were going to do in this movie. And it's funny, I was talking with our editor, Cam Smith, who we both know.
Sure.
And he was like, you know, what's the podcast going to be on? I was like, it's this Nicolas Cage documentary. He's like, well, tell me about it. And I was like, all right, so the easiest way I can tell you, it's what happened to the failed Nicolas Cage document or Superman project and how that ended up being Wild Wild West.
Right.
And he just kind of looks at me and was like, what? And I was like, just listen to the podcast when it comes out. So we're going to get into this. This is an official spoiler warning. I'm thankful for Celeste Davis, Black Nerd Magic, one of the co-hosts and writers here, because he has taught me how to podcast about documentaries. Documentaries are incredibly hard to talk about, and podcast about. This will probably be pushing 10 documentaries that we've covered this year.
Cool.
So I'm excited to cover this one.
Sure.
And to be honest, perfectly honest with you, I started our $5 tier on Patreon solely to cover this movie.
Amazing. Amazing. Gosh. Yeah, I can imagine, like, I've been thinking about it, like, how do we talk about a documentary? Because, like, there's no plot points. But to be honest with you, like, that's something I wanted to bring up about the alleged movie that the documentary is about. Is, like, so they went through 3 screenwriters, and there was this whole process about, like...
Before you get into it, like, I want to name all of these people.
Okay,
so
that's going to be all you.
And let's kind of, like, walk through what these... Because all of the filmographies behind all these guys are completely different.
Sure, yeah.
So first off, you have Kevin Smith, who's just coming off of the indie darling that was Chasing Amy.
Sure.
Well, sorry, it was before Chasing Amy, so he's coming off of
Mallrats,
Clerks
wasn't it?
and Mallrats.
Yeah.
And if you've ever heard any of Kevin Smith's podcasts, ever read any of his comic books, seen any of his movies, Kevin Smith is a nerd.
Yeah. Yeah, like he was who was first, like, pitched to, hey, do you want to write this script?
Well, he originally went in to do the other famous Tim Burton movie that's never been made, Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian, which, again, is such a bonkers title for me. So he went in for that pitch.
That's right.
And then Superman
and somebody
came
mentioned
up.
Superman, and he was like, wait, what? And, like, he basically just kind of grabbed onto it.
So the thing to keep in mind, talking about context and time-wise here, is Superman 4, A Quest for Peace. The company that distributed that, because at the time, I don't believe it was Warner Brothers. Sure. I believe it was a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. That movie underperformed so incredibly well.
Bad?
So, yes, so terribly.
So terribly, yeah.
Bankrupted the studio.
Wow.
So when you go, and that's like 1986 or 1987, so you have Superman, Quest for Peace, and 2006, which is almost...
That's almost 20 years.
20 years, 19 to 20 years.
Yeah.
Where you're not doing a Superman movie, and they had many failed attempts, but even entering into 1996, where all of this begins with Kevin Smith,
sure,
that's still 9 years without a Superman movie. And it was because they had that fear of, where do we go and where we take these characters?
It's very interesting, actually, because the Superman animated series did so well, but I guess that is a different game. Yeah, gosh, I can't imagine. Like, I can't imagine kind of going for that again and wanting to, like, hey, what if we did this? Because realistically, like, in film years, like, that's less than a decade. That's not long, and especially to recover from a bankruptcy. But I guess, like, after all the Batman success, like, why not, you know? Because there was a lot of, well... I say success. You know, maybe there wasn't quite that much praise to say about some of, like, the later Batman films, but, you know, for sure on Tim Burton's end, like the Michael Keaton films, while they were, like, sort of questionable in their casting choice, which they talk about that, did, like, performed super, super well. I'm sure that was super encouraging on WB's end.
At this time, we're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Hey everybody, this is Dino with her podcast.
And Michelle. I almost cut you off.
That's okay. We just want to let you know that you can find us at gangalley.com.
Like a gang in an alley. Gangalley.com.
We're on iHeartRadio, Podbean, Spotify, Podcast Addict, Pocket Cast, Breaker, Double Pod, Apple, and we have a YouTube channel for supplemental material. But what do we normally talk about?
Oh gosh, everything, honestly.
Yep.
We touch on whatever's poignant that week.
Yeah. We wrap it into movies, TV, pop culture, whoever's ticking us off.
Ticking me off, usually.
Social media toxicity, but we always have one important message.
The most important message.
Be decent to each other. So check us out.
Our podcast. Huh?
Peace.
So Superman made for $17 million. And when you look, that's
Superman.
That's
number
Superman
one.
4.
Okay,
Superman number 4 made for $17 million. That's
sure.
solely production.
Okay.
So they say that if you want to truly understand and gauge how much a film is profitable, you want to take the budget that you spent on the actual movie and multiply it by 2. So let's just round and say $35 million is where we made it.
Sure.
He ended its domestic box office with $15.6 million.
Wow.
So huge loss for the studio there.
Yeah.
And so I want to jump in and, I think it's interesting, we're keeping on the topic of talking about screenwriters. Kevin Smith doing his script was really interesting because he had basically done the death and rebirth of Superman.
Yeah. So he talks about it. He doesn't go into the frustrating thing for me about this whole documentary is they never really talk plot points. Mm-mm. They just talk like features, what they wanted in the movie, what they wanted to show, etc. But the only time in the documentary that you can really kind of get a feel for a plot is actually when Kevin Smith is talking about his script, because he talks about, I want to bring in Cyborg Superman, I want to bring in Eradicator, and all this stuff. And if you're familiar with the death of Superman and then the comics following the death of Superman, there were basically 3 or 4 different people playing Superman, quote unquote, playing Superman at the time, and they were Cyborg Superman and Eradicator and people like that. There was more, but
Superboy also was in that round. But
that's right.
He wasn't in Kevin Smith's.
Superboy was not in Kevin Smith's
No.
script, but you could tell that Kevin Smith, like being a comic book nerd, was just gonna be like, all right, we're gonna, it had been a few years since Superman 75 when he died, and we're gonna do a death of Superman and a death and rebirth of Superman movie, and you could tell like he was going with some of the major, players in the comic books following the death. But then he added, like, I think even in his script, Brainiac was kind of a part of it. And then I think everybody, like Luthor, was unquestionable. They wanted Luthor no matter what.
So it's at Smith's. Smith had the rules basically that he had to follow from producer John Peters.
That's right.
3 rules was Superman couldn't fly, he couldn't have a suit. And in the third act, he had to fight a giant freaking spider.
Yeah. Although, I will point out, though, he was like, Peters was like, he can't be wearing that suit. And so, like, I think, I don't know. I think Kevin Smith was going to try to go for, like, a variant of the Superman suit rather than, like, the traditional suit, because I don't think Peters was against that. But either way, it was, like, the next scene in the documentary. Peters was like, yeah, no, I never set up those first 2 rules. And he was like, of course Superman has to fly. But yeah, I don't know. Like, Kevin Smith explained that, like, Peters didn't want him to fly because he said that it looked fake. And he said some unseemly things about the suit as well.
So we'll talk about, like, kind of the plots and stuff like that in a little bit. But basically what happens, Tim Burton comes into the picture.
Yeah.
Didn't really like Smith, so Burton enters. Smith gets fired. They bring in Wesley Strict, I believe that was his name, and he was basically the ghostwriter for some of Batman Returns scenes.
Yep.
I think he'd worked with him on Mars Attacks. I'm not too familiar with his filmography, but basically he came in, and Smith's was too much fanboy. And Strick's version was basically like, it's hard to explain the way that they kind of describe it.
So the vibe that I get starting there, because the documentary probably spends more time with Strick's script than the other 2.
Yeah.
Because there was 3 total, and the bulk of the documentary talks about that one. And something that is like he really establishes that they do kind of hold and continue is like, and this was a lot of Tim Burton's vision, not necessarily just Strick's writing, but Tim Burton really wanted to explore the idea that, like, Superman is an alien. He's from an alien world. He has alien, nemesis. And that is sort of what he wanted to look at. He wanted to look at Superman as an outcast. So much of, like, what comes in is like, oh, we have Brainiac and he's, flying around, and it gets very almost sci-fi.
It's more traditional sci-fi than
Yeah.
it is comic book.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, the easiest way to explain how they were going to approach Superman, it almost feels like Edward Scissorhands in space.
Yeah, because it was about, like, a guy who's, like, torn and from his home world and feels rejected and like an outcast on the world that he's on. I mean, it has Tim Burton's fingerprints just all over it.
Well, there's a point in the documentary later on where Schnepp is interviewing the costume designer, and she points out that Clark Kent would have been a bigger freak than Superman, and that idea fascinates me.
Same.
Honestly. And I think that there's so much of what Burton and Strict were doing and how they were constructing this that just fascinates me. Like the idea of basically as Superman dies, he's going through this like almost rebirth process, and there's a suit, visually speaking, that is reflective of that process. Like that idea is just not only beautiful and mesmerizing because they show like the camera test of it, but it's such a fascinating approach to the Superman character.
Yeah, it's weird. That's something that's like something that really gets dropped and sort of lost, in my opinion, from the Smith script. Is like a sense of like, I guess continuity, not the word I want to use, but like the original media, the original, like they really were strong. They had strong feelings about like, they don't want to make this a movie like for the nerds, you know, like for the comic book guys who sit in their basement and, you know, give bad reviews on the internet. Like they did not want to make a movie for those guys. And it was like, I kind of understand that, but that was something that was like kind of hard for me to swallow because it's like, well, I am one of those guys. So yeah, but they had some really interesting things there as far as the suit goes. And they began to explore almost this, it reminded me of like kind of like a Lazarus pool kind of a deal, is like he is sort of, for a few minutes out of the movie, he had this strange suit on, like Josh was saying, just this like rebirth sort of suit that kind of revitalized him, and he was in like this kind of like an embryonic sort of chamber is the best phrase I could use, and it was supposed to like assist in bringing him back to life or do the act itself of bringing him back to life.
So let's kind of step into a little bit more modern day and a step back from this documentary just for a few seconds. Sure. One of the ideas and controversy that's coming out of most recent versions of Superman was Man of Steel. And Man of Steel was such a non-traditional approach to that character.
Sure.
A lot of the ideas that Strict and Burton were going to explore with him being an outsider, I really feel like I think it was David S. Goyer who wrote that script, but I feel like he really embodied a lot of those ideas, because when we meet Superman at first, he's very much just this outsider. He's trying to like isolate himself from the rest of the world, and he's almost a ghost. Mm-hmm. I think there's even a part in that movie, it's been a while since I've seen it, but where Lois basically calls him a ghost.
Yeah.
And fans just were not about that idea. And that, to me, that's one of the reasons why I love Man of Steel so much,
sure,
is because it explores Superman in such a new and refreshing light, but it also humanizes him.
Yeah.
And I think even in today, you know, this was going to be made in 90s.
Yeah.
And even in 2013 and even today in 2020, fans still aren't okay with the idea of humanizing Superman. And in my opinion, if you don't humanize that character, an unstoppable force, he's just boring.
Yeah. Yeah, he's not only boring, he's like he's unrelatable, which I think I've heard a lot of people say they don't like Superman because they feel like he's unrelatable, and I'm just yeah, I don't know. It's weird that you say that, actually, because in my experience, like a lot of people, shoot, I don't know where I was going with this. Yeah, I really didn't know that people had that problem with Man of Steel, to be honest with you.
Oh, like, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That's weird.
At least in the conventions and the conversations that Eric and I have had doing the convention circuit, a lot of people just don't like the approach to Superman because it's too dark. It's very angsty, almost, to a certain degree, and of him trying to find his own identity and discover who he is, and being this lone survivor. It brings that into a very real, very modern, and very relatable transition, because, you know, I think at some point we, in our own lives, where, you know, we discover, who am I really? Like, sure, I'm my mother's and my father's son, and I'm my sister's brother, and I'm my wife's husband, but who is it that, you know, really makes me tick? And that part of the journey, I think, was just something we had never seen before with that character. And it sounds like a lot of those eggs that we see in Man of Steel, this Wesley stripped strict.
Yeah.
Script. That's a tongue twister.
Strict script. Yeah, I think you're right. That is a good point. But yeah, I don't know. It was really interesting though. A lot of the stuff that I want to talk about was like, really there were some awesome, amazing, really cool notions that they had that they were talking about doing, just with the character. And I think a lot of the reason why it was sort of a controversial thing, why it was eventually shelved and stuff like that, was because it was just like, I don't know, people were nervous the idea of Tim Burton doing Superman, which is probably, that's probably fair, because if people didn't like how dark Man of Steel apparently was, which in my opinion as a superhero movie, that movie was not dark, then the Burton film probably would have been real weird. But you're right, you made a point earlier, you were like, I love the idea that they were saying that Clark Kent would be kind of the weirdo and the freak. I think that actually may have done something to save like a lot of the fans' response to sort of a rejected, outcasted Superman, because if you make Clark Kent like the weird dude, then Superman gets to be the juxtaposition of not that. He gets to just be like sort of the knight in shining armor that we think of.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that aspect of him, this movie spends so much time kind of on the mechanics of who Superman was, the script, but we do get a little taste of how Nicolas Cage would have been as Clark Kent. And it's in these like very old like VHS camera test. And I love his approach to the character where, he's like, okay, Superman is this very prim and proper kind of character. Clark Kent needs to be the opposite. Like, Clark Kent needs to be, like, bumbling. Like, he needs to kind of almost be like a doofus. So, the camera footage that we get is Nicolas Cage, slick back hair, Mickey Mouse t-shirt, a blue blazer, and khaki pants.
Yeah, it's really weird. It's like, that's dress casual, but I don't know where you're going. It's really strange and awkward, and that's something they didn't talk too much about, like dialogue, which I really wish they would have gotten into more. They really talked mostly about concepts, but that's something that like I would have wanted to know a lot more about. Is like, hey, like if this is kind of the awkward, weird, Clark Kent that you want, what would he be like on like a dialogue level? How would he be with Lois? Because they absolutely were going to put Lois Lane in the film and potentially have like a love story arc, in the film. And I would have wanted to know, because I think, especially with what you said, Josh, about like Man of Steel, we have seen a Superman who struggles feeling like he's a part of this world. And like he can be in this world and exist and not have that like weird, offset, rejected sort of mindset. But seeing like a Clark Kent that's just like, I don't know.
So I want to jump back into screenwriting because I want to start jumping in and talking about the other parts of this project. And Dan Gilroy was the guy that was brought on to do the last script. He spent about a year on it, and a lot of his ideas were more conventional. I felt like he probably pulled a little bit from Smith, a little bit more from Strict, and kind of took aspects of both of their scripts, kind of married them into a more traditional approach of what we would think of as a comic book movie.
Yeah.
And Gilroy went on to actually write and direct a fantastic Jake Gyllenhaal movie called Nightcrawler.
Really?
Fantastic movie.
That's weird.
Just had to throw that in there, that Nightcrawler writer, had his hands in Superman at one point.
That was one of the fun things about this movie, is like who they brought in or who they were talking about bringing in. because they had like I think didn't they have like a Matrix guy in there at one point, and like there were just so many weird little things. I mean, it makes sense. Like you expect like people who worked on Batman films to return for another WB superhero film done by Tim Burton. Like that makes sense. But it was really interesting. I want to talk about Lois. I want to talk about those casting choices they were talking about.
Let's talk about these casting choices. So we'll talk about Nicolas Cage in just a little bit. We've touched on it, but the supporting cast that they would have had would have been who they talked about was Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Brainiac, and Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
Lex Luthor, the main choice that they had.
Oh, and Doomsday, but they never talked about a cast member for him.
Yeah, they never did. We'll talk about villains in just a little bit, but Lex Luthor was going to be played by Kevin Spacey, who went on to play Luthor in Bryan Singer's 2006
Superman Returns.
I wanted to kind of throw a jab at that movie.
That's funny. I've never seen that movie.
That movie is so terrible.
Oh, what happens?
Jim Carrey or Christopher Walken was talked about as Brainiac.
I would have loved... Okay, so Jim Carrey's my favorite actor. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like, if you told me Jim Carrey was going to be Superman, I'd be like, cool. Can I donate to the project? Like I love Jim Carrey. I would love to see him do almost anything. So like that idea, that notion is really interesting, especially since like I haven't seen Jim Carrey in a lot of like powerful stoic roles like Brainiac would have to be. But they talked really heavily, probably more so about Christopher Walken.
Christopher Walken would have been my pick for this character.
Yeah.
And it's crazy for how much of an accomplished actor he is. He's never stepped into this arena of comic book movies.
Yeah, it's true.
That blows my mind. And to have him play Brainiac would have been brilliant because we're still at this point 5-6 years away from his villainous role in The Rundown, which I love him in that movie.
Yeah, same.
He has such a way about him of walking that line between sinister and charismatic so incredibly well.
He was also, was he not in The Prophecy as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's turned in these like villainous roles, but
sure.
I think him as an actor is just such an interesting choice.
Yeah, I think it would have been a bold choice, but it's also like, and they talked about this toward the beginning of the movie, I think Kevin Smith did, where it's like when you see Christopher Reeves as Superman, what you see is Superman. You don't see Christopher Reeves playing Superman. And that's what he was talking about when it came to Nick Cage, is he's like, I would see Nick Cage in a Superman costume. I would not see Superman. And I think that's kind of where I'm coming from when it comes to like Christopher Walken. Like, I don't at all think he could have done a bad job, but I could not help but see Christopher Walken green with weird things on his head.
I can see that, and I can understand that.
Yeah.
But to me, I feel like had this movie come out in the roundabout, because they actually did have a release date. They were supposed to come
July
out
July 4th, 1998.
There you go. Good, so good.
I'm really good with numbers for some reason.
So you would have had a 3-year separation between Riddler and Brainiac.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of my big hang up on that. Like, I love Jim Carrey as an actor. I think that he is able to take on villainous roles really well.
Sure.
Riddler is the reason that I love Batman Forever so much.
Sure.
And his return as Dr. Robotnik in Sonic the Hedgehog this year.
Yeah.
So good. But I just don't think... I feel like he would have been a little bit too funny in that role. And at that point in his career, he hadn't really done a whole lot of dramatic roles. So we hadn't seen him.
You're right, but it's just like, that's kind of where I'm coming from, is I'm like, but what if? You know, like, what if that was his first... Because especially in the 90s, it would have been really weird, really big culture shock. But I think he could have done it. And what if it was Jim Carrey as, like, powerful, like, stone-faced, stoic, genius Brainiac? You know, like, I don't know. Like, I see where you're coming from. I don't at all think that you're wrong. I don't even really disagree with you. I just think he could have done it, and I think it would have been incredible to see. But you make a great point about just that distance that just a 3-year gap between those two movies is probably a little too close. I mean, there is like Johnny Storm versus Captain America. Honestly, most people now, they see Chris Evans and they don't even think Johnny Storm. And it was less than 10 years between those two films.
Yeah, so my other argument for that of why I would want Christopher Walken is when you look at Nicolas Cage, conventionally you don't see a Superman archetype for him.
Yeah.
And people in the 80s thought the same thing about Michael Keaton as Batman.
Right. And they were wrong.
They were wrong.
Yeah.
And then you have an esteemed actor like Jack Nicholson taking on the Joker.
Yeah.
And I think you have an esteemed actor like Christopher Walken taking on Brainiac. It would have been that Batman-Joker dynamic, just under the guise of Superman Brainiac, still with that through line of Tim Burton direction.
Yeah, honestly, that's a great point, especially since, like, something else I don't always think of is, like, okay, we're talking a Christopher Walken that is almost 25 years younger than he is right now. And that's really hard, I think, for me to wrap my mind around, because I haven't seen a ton of, like, I don't think I've seen a ton of younger, like, 90s Christopher Walken. Meanwhile, I've seen a ton of 90s Jim Carrey. That is a great point, and I think you're right. And I think if anybody was going to do it and make it work and make it cool, whether or not everyone liked it, regardless, Tim Burton could have pulled that off.
And another interesting character that really excites me and disappoints me that this project never got made, Chris Rock as Jimmy Olsen. I love Chris Rock. Like, I grew up on Saturday Night Live.
Sure.
So seeing him in the 90s, like, I think that he would have been the comic relief for that movie.
Sure.
And keeping also in mind that Burton has really unconventional choices when it comes to some of these side characters.
True.
Because Batman 3 from him would have featured Robin, and it was also supposed to have Marlon Wayans playing Robin.
Weird.
Would have been awesome, though.
Weird. My hang up on a lot of that stuff is age. Because, like, to me, like, Jimmy Olsen, like, he's like 20, maybe 20, And then, like, same thing with Robin. It's like, that dude needs to be like 16 tops. Like, that's my thing. Because honestly, like, the fact that they're comedians could work. That is my other big hang up, is like, I don't necessarily want a funny Robin or a funny Jimmy Olsen, unless it's funny in like a slapstick clumsy sort of way. But next to Clark Kent, like, I don't want Clark Kent to be the non-clumsy one. I want Clark Kent to kind of be the clumsy one. So I don't know. That's
so it's interesting too. It's because, like, the tone of Superman Lives, though we don't know the narrative or the dialogue or whatever, a lot of this stuff seems like it would have been a gothic, almost Shakespearean drama.
Yeah, very true. Very true. It seems like they were going really big in themes.
Yeah. And I think throwing Chris Rock in the middle of that would have been an interesting juxtaposition, especially given his, like, Saturday Night Live, like, and at this point too, when they're talking about making this movie, he hadn't done Dogma, he hadn't done Down to Earth, he hadn't done Head of State, he hadn't been the movie star that we know.
That's a good point.
Was Saturday Night Live and occasionally showing up in, like, SNL movies and, like, playing bit roles. Like, he hadn't had that big break that he had in Dogma.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's also one of those things too, where it's like, maybe to kind of go back and use the Jim Carrey kind of argument, it's like we would have gotten a very Jim Carrey than we were used to. We could have gotten a very different Chris Rock than we know. Like, yeah, you're right, he could have been the comic relief, but maybe not at all. Maybe he just wouldn't have been. And I think that would be something I would rather see. I would rather see Chris Rock actually be serious and young and naive and, like, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen.
and we don't even know really to what context.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
Daily Planet, Metropolis, and the one that I know, the casting we have been talking about, you want to do so bad, is Lois Lane.
Yeah.
And some names that were tossed around: Courtney Cox, Arquette, which she's coming off of the first 2 Scream movies.
She wasn't Arquette at the time.
That's right. She wasn't until like late 90s. Yeah. Sorry. But the one that they were circling around most was Sandra Bullock.
Sandy Bullock. Oh my gosh. That would have been hilarious. Like, that would have been, I think, honestly, I would have been fine with Courtney Cox. Like, either way. Cause the idea of like Courtney Cox next to Nick Cage just sounds like a blast. But I think Sandra Bullock would have been awesome because like she's really fun. She can be funny. She can be kind of silly, and you don't have to take her seriously. But when like she's had so many like really strong, good, like solid dramatic roles, even that are that are kind of like in a juxtaposition to a funny aspect. I think she just would have been amazing because like Lois Lane, something I think gets overlooked about Lois Lane is like she is a freaking headstrong go-getter. I mean, you kind of have to be to like keep Superman in line to some extent, you know? And I think Sandra Bullock would have just been so fun and so cool for that part.
I agree. I think Sandra Bullock would have been the better choice.
Yeah.
Because she's coming off of a career that at this point is including box office hits like Speed, Practical Magic, and even the cult classic The Net. And to me, I feel like seeing Courtney Cox come up against let's just say a babbling version of Nicolas Cage as Clark Kent would have felt too much like the David Arquette, Courtney Cox, Dewey and Gale Weathers from Scream. Like that would have just felt new setting, but the same idea.
Yeah, that was kind of the other thing I was going to say is like I think I would have liked Courtney Cox, but I think it's one of those things where it's like I would have seen Courtney Cox as Lois Lane instead of seeing Lois Lane, and that's really what I want. Like I want an actor or actress that's going to step into a role and own the crap out of it. And personally, I don't think I could have not seen Monica, you know, like that kind of thing.
It would have been hard to separate yourself from that. And that's why she's so good in those Scream movies, is because like people at that time, they only saw her as Monica.
Yeah.
And so when you see her as just this ice cold, vindictive person, in Scream, it's such a weird thing, and it shows her range extraordinarily well.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel like she fits in that. But to me, I feel like her as Lois Lane would have just been a rehash of Gale Weathers.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I don't disagree with that at all. What was the third name though? There was like I
didn't write it down, unfortunately.
Dang, there was 3.
There was 3.
I cannot remember the second one.
But you know what there was 3 of also, and this is the part of the movie that scares me most of what this movie would have been, because we saw how 3 villains in Spider-Man 3, we see how 3 villains in Batman and Robin, how they kind of make comical messes out of these properties.
Yeah.
And we would have had Doomsday, Luthor, and hold on. We also would have had the merging of Lexiac.
Okay, that was not an idea that continued throughout the end of the movie, though.
It wasn't. It was in one of the drafts. But
likely
still,
would not have been made, but you're not wrong.
So Lexiac, which was this hybrid where Lex Luthor and Brainiac fused each other together, and they could basically almost switch faces, kind of
or it was like a combination of the two.
Yeah,
they didn't portray it the same way twice.
So he kind of almost reminds me of the mayor from The Nightmare Before Christmas, where he has the ability to like swing.
Okay,
like,
so
flip heads.
Freaking what's his name from Hitchhiker's Guide?
Yeah.
But see, here's the thing. Here's the thing about even that is like, I'm not gonna get the combination of Lex Luthor and Brainiac. All I'm going to be doing is thinking about the fact that Kevin Spacey and Christopher Walken are occupying the same space.
So you have that. So you have those two villains. You have Doomsday, which Doomsday, like, let me ask you this before we start talking about Doomsday.
Sure.
How do you feel about how they portrayed Doomsday and Batman versus Superman?
All right, so I watched the what is it, the Ultimate Edition, for the first time last week. I'd actually never seen it and liked the movie anyway. Like, I wasn't like a hater before then, but man, I think Doomsday was very interesting, very cool. I think the way that they kind of bring him up is like he's a weird, like, bastardized version of Superboy in a way, because originally Superboy was a clone of Clark and Lex, and they made Doomsday sort of a clone of Lex and Zod. So that was kind of cool. I think it was great. I think, like, the way his power set worked was very clear and obvious. I loved it. I really have no complaints. I loved the way that I thought it was a blast.
So follow-up question,
Sure.
Do you think they introduced him too early into the DCEU? Because at this point, you have Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman, Superman dies. So you're 2 films into your universe, and your anchor flagship hero dies.
Okay. I see your point, but I think the problem is that, like, the movie at this point still remains out of context. And that is a really hard question to answer without follow-up material. And I mean, yeah, you can bring up Justice League all you want to, but Justice League wasn't received well. We're getting the Snyder Cut, and so excited. Holy crap. And I just think that, like, what I would have wanted personally, and I don't know if they would have done this, but, like, you're going to kill your flagship hero, let the B-listers come up. Because in the 90s and, like, late 80s and 90s, what happened is, like, when bigger characters started to die, Titans began to, like, really take the reins of the universe. And that is what I personally would have wanted to happen. I would want to see, like, Superboy, I'd want to see Nightwing, I'd want to see people, like, really, like, respond to that well. Do I think they killed Superman too early? Maybe, and I hate that that's the best answer I have.
So this is where I come from, and A, fight for BVS, and B, I also liked the way that they used that storyline to set up for Justice League.
Sure.
Because the idea around Superman has always been, if you have this omnipotent God, why on earth do you need a
team? Yeah.
And it's always been an interesting thing to talk about, like, how you create something. And I love the way the Justice League animated series did it. I love the way that Jeff Johns did it. And I was really anxious to see how they were going to bring together this idea of Justice League into the cinematic universe. Heroes together.
Yeah, hard agree on that. Yeah, that was really cool.
But I think it's a very ballsy move.
Sure.
To make 2 films into your universe to tell that story.
Sure.
But at the same time, like, when it comes to Doomsday, for me, I feel like we haven't seen a proper Doomsday. And one of the things we read the comic book years ago, one of the things that I found myself really gravitating to was the undercurrent of how they introduced Doomsday.
Sure.
And how he's basically just an emotional an emotional void.
Yeah.
Like, he is basically just anger incarnate.
Yeah.
And that's such a fascinating idea to pit up against Superman. And I feel like out of especially being, like, the death of Superman and the it was a whirlwind event.
Yeah.
Secret Origin, which was a phenomenal DC Comics documentary, talked about how like they had people calling off of work because of like Superman dying. Like it was their biggest seller that they had in a decade at that point.
Yeah.
People were literally writing in to DC hate mail saying, bring back Superman. The only reason Superman came back after that event was because of how pissed people got in response to that. Sure. And to me, I feel like this whirlwind phenomenon that you're basing your movie on, to not even get the main antagonist right in your portrayal seems like a huge misfire, that you would have just been a monster. And Burton talks about in this documentary that he's not inherently a comic guy.
Yeah.
And he basically had this idea of making Doomsday a monster that was just full of people's faces.
Yeah, I couldn't stand that. I think that like you make really valid points about the Doomsday we got, but that Doomsday would have been worse.
Like it's just like,
I'm sorry, it would have been worse. But also, I know this is off topic, but you brought this up. But I think that like while it's really bold of them 2-3 movies into a cinematic universe to kill their flag, as a viewer, the first thing I thought was like, I want more now than I would have wanted had this not happened. I wanted more movies. I wanted more context. I was that much more excited because their like first movie's protagonist was gone, because I knew that they wanted to start a universe. And the fact that they were like, and you brought up the idea that like they used his death to as like a catalyst for, and to me it was ask questions that I needed answering.
Yeah, and I feel like the Justice League or the DCEU version of Doomsday that we got was good for what it was.
Sure.
Point of, and I'm also coming from a point of context as far as time is concerned as well, because you're only the time they're pitching these ideas, you are 3 to 5 years removed from the biggest event the comics had undergone at that time.
Yeah, true.
I think the death of Superman was even bigger than the breaking of Batman's back and
Sure.
Bane. Like you are on this like just a super like record high for comics, and so you're trying to capitalize on that, and it just seems like a big disappointment, like to not even like, to me, like the way that this, I feel like this narrative would have gone was Brainiac would have been, Lex Luthor would have been a minor villain, Brainiac would have been the larger like main villain overall.
Sure.
And then the final boss of the movie would have been Doomsday.
Yeah.
I think you would have had that comic respect of seeing him kind of escape and then develop until he eventually comes face to face with Superman.
So I can't say you're wrong. Obviously, the movie never got made, but I think they spent way too much time and effort into that like regeneration process. I think that Doomsday actually could have been earlier on in the movie. I think that Doomsday might have been like second act.
At that point too, because I let it slip that from my mind. I got so wrapped up in comic lore,
True.
I let it go. I think you're right. I think to some degree that, I mean, Brainiac would have been the big bad. I don't know.
Maybe like Brainiac releases Doomsday onto the planet to see what Superman would do, to see what Superman could do.
There's so many different ways that you can go with this,
Sure.
and this is the one thing I hate about multiple villains in movies.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're going to do it, it has to be done extremely well. Yeah. And we heard whispers of what Ben Affleck's The Batman was going to be, And I don't know if you ever read Scott Snyder's run on Batman, but his first issue that he ever did basically was this prison riot scene, and it had Zaz, it had Mad Hatter, Joker, Riddler, it just had a plethora of Batman's rogue galleries. And I feel like that was done in really good taste. And there was rumors that was supposed to be how the movie was going to open up.
Yeah.
You were going to have one central villain, but you were going to use all these. And I think that if those villains are used in the right context, okay, cool. I'm with it.
Sure.
I'm here for it. But I feel like, to me, the way that they described Lex Luthor, the way that they described LexCorp, all the concept art that we get of Brainiac and even Doomsday.
Yeah, the Skull Ship, yeah.
You're getting so much of that. And that's, I feel like, what terrifies me. I feel like this would have had just been a 90s muddled mess in the vein of Batman and Robin.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Having multiple villains is hard. I think you can have two villains when one of them is Lex, because Lex usually will he'll use somebody else. He'll capitalize off of someone else. Lex is a lot more of a tactician. I don't think they would have put him in the big green and purple suit.
No.
I would like to see that, but I think having Lex Luthor in a movie as more of a criminal mastermind would work, but having three villains, one of them being Lex, you're right. I think that's just too much, especially since they were talking about all these. The idea of Brainiac has this skull ship. It's it's shaped like a skull. Flies through space, and he has they presented the idea of him collecting monsters and aliens from other planets. And so it was sort of implied that Superman might fight some of these monsters. So it's you're throwing in henchmen that are the size of houses or bigger.
Don't forget about the Thanagarian snare monster.
Oh my god. Their stupid fixation on he needs to fight a giant spider. Why is this got to be it right now? He just. I don't understand. And that's where Wild Wild West comes in, right? And they can the movie and then give a giant spot of Wild Wild West, and it still fails because WB is a terrible company with
WB
really
made
great rights.
So from 97 until 90, from probably 96 to 98. When they're talking about this, because even though it had a tentative release date of summer 98, the closer that you get to Dan Gilroy, the more that you kind of see, okay, that is going to be uprooted and we're going to move this to 99. They don't ever talk about that, but that's my theory, because they're showing all of these bombs that are just hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into these productions, and you're lucky if you're seeing 10% come back.
Yeah.
And Wild Wild West had a budget of $170 million and had a return domestically of $113.8 million.
Yeah. Yeah, that's over $50 million loss, that
more, because you got to keep in the marketing in mind as well.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a couple $100 million loss.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was something they brought up when it came to the Superman Lives. Is it was going to be, I think production alone was 140.
Which for in that day and in that time period, that's a decent amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a decent, and it's still less than the production they put into Wild Wild West. I think the fact of the matter is that honestly, my theory, I think they put all their cards on Will Smith being in the movie, because Will Smith at the time would have a rap single that would go along with a flick, and I think they put all their cards on that, because the fact of the matter was that Tim Burton and Nick Cage making a weird disjointed Superman film risky. And I mean, sure.
And keeping in the terms of antagonists, there was also a sequence in the Dan Gilroy script where Superman had to fight, get this, ninjas.
Yeah, that's right. So, like, okay, I'll be honest with you, I hate that. But, like, in the comic books, Superman does know a Kryptonian martial art. And it's something that's rarely ever seen or brought much attention to. That would be really, really cool. However, leave it to the Turtles, man. Like, that's...
So, like, that's... All right, so that's like the idea of that John Peters tells Kevin Smith after his first draft, there's a couple notes. You have to, at the Fortress of Solitude, you have to give Superman polar bear bodyguards when Brainiac comes down.
Yeah, basically the idea was that like Brainiac is gonna come see Superman at the Fortress of Solitude, but they wanted there to be a fight. And so somebody suggested like Peters was like, well, what if you had bodyguards? And Smith is like, he's Superman. It's called the Fortress of Solitude. That would be pointless. It would defeat all the purposes, you know? And so he's like, well, what if we had like a 12, 15 foot like polar bear? And so the idea that they kind of came up with was like there would be like two polar bears and they were both really big and Brainiac would just kill one of the other and would run away. And it was just, I don't know. To me, like, I'm a dialogue guy sometimes, especially when it comes to characters I really care about. So like if you want Brainiac to walk up in the Fortress of Solitude and have like an argument or monologue with Superman, man, give it to me. I would much rather have that than any fight, if I'm being really honest. Like, my favorite parts of movies like Justice League and Civil War are just the dialogue, because the dialogue is so freaking good. It's so good. Like, but I'm also like, I realize that I'm probably a minority in that kind of thing, and I also just didn't like Civil War. But
Brainiac, Peters also wanted, quote, action. He wanted intensity.
Yeah,
he's like, why? You know, he's at this Fortress of Solitude. Why isn't he doing anything? And my comeback with that is like the idea that Brainiac would vanquish a polar bear. That's even assuming he would just show up to the front door and not just find some way just to get inside to penetrate the Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah. Brainiac is not that stupid, and he does not need petty displays of power.
No.
He doesn't.
No. And when you read, Jeff Johns had a great run, 6-part run called Superman Brainiac years ago.
Sure.
And, I mean, Brainiac basically spends a large portion of the majority in the Skull ship and basically just, like, F's with Superman's, like, psychologically.
Sure.
And so, you know, I feel like one of the notes that I took down was, did John Peters ever actually either A, pick up a comic book, or B, even know anything about Superman lore and mythology?
Yeah, which is where, like, this conversation's sort of hard to have, because, like, we like comic books, we've read Superman, we have a much greater awareness, you probably more than I, but, like, still, like, these are people who didn't know anything about comic books and the characters they were working with, trying to make a high-budget, well-done movie about these characters, and that's got to stop. That happens still, and it's got to stop.
Yeah, so you get a lot of, like, a large portion of them wanting to fight a giant spider. You get the backlash of, you know, wanting to basically have just like the polar bears and like the ninjas. Like, you get like all of these like just non-Superman elements,
right,
in an otherwise fantastical universe.
Sure.
Because just the way that they describe it and the visuals that they use, like, this was supposed to be this very larger than life, fantastical, visually stunning, just parade of talent.
Yeah.
Just mesmerizing your eyeballs.
Yeah, and I am in no way against a Superman sci-fi film. I think it'd be weird to have, Perry and Jimmy and characters like that in it. But, I would love an off-planet Superman film. That would be a lot of fun. That could be really, really cool. Where you don't spend the majority of time on Earth, That would be amazing. But, yeah, the thing I kept thinking watching the documentary is I was just like, they wanted to do so much. And I'm not even hearing plot points, and I think that's scary.
Well, let's jump into the man of the hour. Not quite Nicolas Cage yet, but Tim Burton as the director of this movie. Sure. They mention in here, because you look at Tim Burton's filmography up to this point, and he had done Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Beetlejuice, Batman, Edward Scissorhands, Batman Returns, Ed Wood, Mars Attacks, and he was slated to do Sleepy Hollow right after this property.
Yeah, and had written Nightmare.
Yeah, and he had written Nightmare. So all of these gothic properties, and he's coming in to do this very optimistic, very hopeful hero journey. And I love the way that Gilroy explained it, is that they were going to tell this story. It was going to be Superman, but it was going to be emotional angst.
Sure. And
you were going to bring that in there. And there's even a part where talking about how they were going to do Superman's story simply so that Burton could prove to himself that he could make a story in brighter themes and lights.
Yeah, it was very much like the idea of, I kind of thought of Midsummer. It's just like, hey, let's make a daylight horror film. And that was the idea. It was like Tim Burton being like, hey, I wonder if I can make a bright, shiny, optimistic, pretty movie. Because up to that point, he had never really ever done that.
With the exception of Pee-wee.
Yeah, that's true. And even that was still kind of just like, it still had his fingerprints on it. It was still weird. It was still like, not only that, but it was probably a smaller budget than this. It was not to the scale.
Yeah, he's an interesting choice that I think as his filmography has gone on and he's done more optimistic stories, whether you're talking about last year's Dumbo or you're talking about Big Eyes, or The Big Fish is another great example of just kind of him getting to play with brighter palettes and storylines and themes, and I feel like having him take this on would have been an interesting choice, and that's really what persuades me most about him.
Yeah,
is that he doesn't seem like he would be the right guy for the job.
Yeah,
but sometimes that's what makes the perfect people.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. And then sometimes, like, don't get me wrong, there are some Tim Burton films that I don't think are good or don't think aspects of went well. But I have said for a long time that he's probably my favorite director. And I think that you're right, and I think we talked about it a little bit when it came to casting. It was just like, you know what, if anybody on the planet is going to make a Nick Cage Superman film with Chris Rock as Jimmy Olsen, and Christopher Walken as Brainiac, yeah, Tim Burton's going to be that guy.
And also, too, a lot of the themes that they're studying are these very outsider, but yet still very humanistic storylines. And also, I think about the lighting and how bright and domesticated the backdrop of Edward Scissorhands is as a film. Sure. And it's the story of this outsider, and you have a character that's largely trying to fit in, is trying to find his purpose and where he fits into this suburban landscape, yeah. And I feel like that's kind of what it would have been for Nicolas Cage, is portrayal of Superman is here you have a character that is presumably going to die fairly early on in the film.
Yeah.
And is going to basically go through this crisis and resurrection of basically being reborn and then going back with a new lease on life and going back to finish the villain that basically presumably killed him.
Yeah.
Or villains, however we would have seen it.
Sure.
But that, I feel like, has that very much that Tim Burton style to it that I don't feel like any other filmmaker at that time could have done.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not wrong. It's like he really does a good job at like, well, I think that you'll notice if you watch a lot of Tim Burton films, they're all very much like they're all kind of love centric to some extent. Whether it's about like familial, like parental love, whether like Coraline, or it's like romantic love, which kind of is in a couple movies, but specifically like Edward Scissorhands explores like the Florence Nightingale effect, and you get so many different themes, and it's like he's always putting really bright, beautiful themes, and positivity in a dark setting. And so this would almost be the opposite. It would almost be like Tim Burton putting like really hard to swallow themes of rejection and things like that in a bright setting, and then having, obviously, Superman, I'm sure, would have to overcome a lot of these things, even emotionally, I'm sure. Yeah, but I mean, honestly, like you brought up his newer films, where Tim Burton has been able to play with like brighter color palettes. The first thing I think of is Sweeney Todd, because like there's the sequence where they're kind of like daydreaming about their potential future, and there's like a beach scene, and it is bright and beautiful and has bright colors, and it's almost silly looking, and it's just, he does it so well, and I think that would be a lot of what would be expected. What I would expect out of like a Superman movie from Tim Burton is like, there would be dark parts, but then there would just be scenes that were just gorgeous,
And so I want to jump back. Can we talk about Brainiac just one more time, real quick? So they mentioned that Superman was basically going to go through this death, rebirth, resurrection arc throughout the course of his journey throughout the film. It was going to be this very cinematic, very dramatic part. And you were going to not only see that with the character, but you were going to see that visually. And they also mentioned that Brainiac was going to go through something similar, where when you first meet him, he was almost going to be like this cosmic Grim Reaper. And then by the time he reaches his final form, he would have been a spider android hybrid. How do you feel about kind of that journey with Brainiac?
I feel like if that, because originally that was not what they were talking about. They were talking about like, what is it, Thanagarian
Snare
Beast, which doesn't make any sense. But but I think if it was the idea that like they weren't doing that anymore, and Brainiac were to end up in this sort of like mechanical spider suit, I don't know. It could have been good. It could have been weird, but I wouldn't put that kind of thing necessarily past Brainiac. I would have been asking why the whole time, but that doesn't mean it just would have been bad on principle.
So I like the concept art that they showed of the head actually in the spider legs.
Okay, but there's no way I'm ever going to see that and not think of Toy Story.
That's a fair point.
Seriously. Which had already come out at the time.
1995, yeah. So you're 3 years removed from that. That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's something I didn't consider. But to me, I feel like it would have fit this particular setting and aesthetic that Burton and the company were trying to create for this version of Superman.
I can't say that you're wrong, but I'm not the only person who would have connected it with Toy Story.
Dang you, Sid.
Come on!
But I like the idea of kind of the hero and the villain almost having not only the same arc and the same journey, but also having that reflected visually is
very cool,
stunning.
Yeah,
thing we've never seen in the comic book genre of film.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. That it would be a very, very cool thing. And they talked about like with Kay, Superman's little like.
I thought about him as kind of like
thing.
Booster Gold's Skeets.
Yeah.
That's kind of what he is, basically.
Yeah.
So I guess like if you're listening and you don't know who Skeets or Booster Gold is, he's basically like an AI version of Alfred, and that's kind of what K would have been.
Yeah, that's kind of what the idea was. Is like K was, I guess it stands for like Krypton or whatever, you know. And it was, you kind of see it in like the Man of Steel thing, or that thing that floats around in the ship. I think that's sort of what they were going for, and they were like, this could like sort of evolve with him, and it would be like a teddy bear when he's a baby, and then eventually, when it came to like him needing to be reborn, K would kind of become like a suit that could encapsulate him, and that he would eventually shed after he's completely reborn, and he would have the black suit that we're familiar with from the comic books after he comes back. Which I didn't hate that whole concept. I really didn't. I thought it was weird, but I think if they'd have done it well, it would have been good.
So I like that concept, and that concept was introduced in the second script by Wesley Strict.
Yep.
And I liked how they orchestrated that, because that's very much familiar with the Superman that we kind of already know, where, you know, he crashes to Earth and Kent's find him. Basically, they raise him as his own, and when he kind of gets to like puberty / like the teenage years, like they kind of explain like, hey, this is where you come from.
They give him the talk.
That's such a better way to put it. And but I like the idea that this last piece of Kryptonian technology, and even in Man of Steel, like it looks very similar to the concept art that we see here.
It actually really does, yeah.
It's almost kind of like they modeled it specifically after that.
Yeah. I wonder, and maybe we could look this up, but I wonder if anybody who worked on that potential project ended up working on Man of Steel.
Maybe. I'd be interested to find that out.
Yeah.
I'll do some research into that, and we'll kind of continue this conversation off air.
That'd be cool.
But I like the idea that he basically is relying on a piece of his lost home world as a personal journey, because it's almost kind of like the journey that they describe Superman's going to go on is kind of like almost this self-discovery journey where he's unsure of himself very early in the movie, and then somehow along the way, like through this death, like he finds how he's really supposed to be. And I feel like that's kind of, you know, the relationship that he would have had with Kay would have been kind of like that to a more like personified level almost.
Yeah. There was one thing about the movie that they talked about, especially in the later, one of the later versions of the second. It was either in the third script or the later versions of the second script, but it was the idea that Lex found the capsule that like brought him to the planet, and like after that was discovered, that was when Superman found out that he was an alien and kind of like emotionally reeled from that. That if that had happened, that movie would have been garbage. It doesn't matter.
That was in the Dan Gilroy script, and I kind of liked the idea that they made Kay Jor-El in his script. I feel like that kind of fit a little bit better than, and it's kind of almost a throwback to the Donner 76 Superman. But the idea of him not understanding and not having knowledge of his Kryptonian roots until he becomes adult, like, dude,
Dumb.
pick up a comic. Like,
Dumb.
that is just one of those foundational things that you need to have in the Superman character.
Yeah. Yep. That's dumb.
I was not liking it one bit.
I don't like it. Yep. That's...
And to find out about it from Lex Luthor of all things.
However, though, I was thinking about this as we were talking about like the trio of villains and how that could have been a catastrophe. Might not have been a trio of villains, because there have been times in comic books it's been portrayed that Lex and Superman are very good friends. And like they're kind of frenemies, but they could have written it where like Lex wasn't the bad guy, or you didn't find out he was until the end, or whatever. You know, where like Lex and Superman were they just knew each other. They were cool.
That's a good point, and I feel like so the trio of villains, it already feels like a muffled mess, but they kind of have the complexity that you would need for a Lex Luthor Superman relationship. You would need the span of more time, I feel like.
I mean, for what they had planned, you'd need the span of more time regardless.
So, let's get into the man of the hour. The reason why we do this podcast, Nicolas Cage as Superman.
This guy. You know, it's really, you can look up some of the like the screen, like the shots that they took, and you'll probably find quite a few different ones, because the suit was in different stages of development as he was wearing it. But you'll find like he has long hair in some pictures and short hair in some later pictures when they got everything like fully developed and colored. And it's kind of one of those things where it's just like, you can't help it. It's Nicolas Cage wearing a Superman suit. That is what it is. Like, there's no way around it. And unless we saw the movie and he blew us away with his acting skills, entirely possible, you'll continue to see that. Did it look bad? No, not at all. The suit, some parts of the suit, in my opinion, especially the cape, looked a little toyish, looked a little like bright and shiny and rubbery. I didn't hate the fact that the suit, like against his body, looked like that, but the cape kind of did too, and I didn't like that at all. It didn't look like super fabric-y in some of the stills. But the suit is bright. It is blue and red and yellow, and it is really like, I would be curious to see like how a lighted, colorized, finished movie version would look. But the suit itself looks fantastic. It's smooth, a lot more like the comic books, is where like I know some people that I've talked to had problems with the Henry Cavill like Superman suit because it was really, they thought it looked like bubble wrap, and yeah, I disagree. Like I think that suit looks amazing, but this suit is a little bit more reminiscent of comic books in that it's like smooth. But it fit him. That's something Josh and I were talking about, like as he was like standing there in some of like the videos they have him in it. He looks so like it fits him so well. He just looks somehow like bigger than you ever realize Nick Cage is, because he kind of dresses a little baggy sometimes and like has kind of like this gangly long form, but he just looks like so broad shouldered and tall, and like it's pretty cool. It's something to behold. Like whether you like it or not, that's to each their own. And there's like he has long hair in some of the earlier shots, which was very 90s for Superman, which would have been really, really cool. I think I love a good long hair, like the mullet of steel. I think that would have been really, really cool. I will say this, I don't like the idea of a long-haired Clark Kent, and I don't know why, but that weirds me out. But it's go look at it. It looks cool. It's wild.
And so we'll throw like concept art and these screenshots up on the Victims and Villains Instagram and Twitter so that you guys can see it. So for me, I think one of the things that when you look at comic book movies that were made in the 80s and the 90s, they were with the exception of Batman, they were very much a product of their time. They reflect the culture and society and color palettes and even soundtracks that was going on at that time.
Baby!
Yeah. My point exactly. So whether you're talking about Mystery Men, Batman...
Oh, man. Now,
Steel...
That's a superhero movie right there, Mystery Man.
Batman Forever, they all look like a product of their time. And I feel like even though it would have been a Burton aesthetic, you still would have had some of that neon flare and some of that flashy 90s Gotham City look.
Yeah, sort of that weird, like, cyberpunk
yeah. aesthetic. And I'm perfectly fine with that.
Sure.
And I feel like to add to that that process of being a product of your time, Nicolas Cage.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something I saw, this is a little off topic, but it works. There were these, like, for lack of a better term, memes about, like, hey, what if MCU happened in the 90s? And it was all these different, like, famed 90s actors and, like, roles that they could have or would have played, you know? And it was just so fun, and some of it was really, like, you wanted to see it, that kind of thing. And I think that's how, like, you got to really think about when it comes to this movie and its potential is, like, you know, you have all these actors at your disposal, like, in their prime. You have Jim Carrey got brought up, and you know who all was in the other superhero movies of the day and stuff, and so many actors now that are just too old to play characters we would have wanted to see them in are in their prime in that day, and it would have been like such a moment, such a cool time to have a movie like this. And I think ultimately, like, you know, I'm sure we'll have like a final thoughts section, but like, I would rather this movie have been made than face the reality it's not made.
Yeah, Nicolas Cage is a really interesting choice for the complexity. And one of the things that I've always told people that hate on Nicolas Cage is that if he's in the hands of a great director, he has potential. And this is in his prime. This is outside of the realm that we know him now of, you know, going from doing something amazing like Mandy to doing something dismal like Grand Isle. Like, he has shown his range. He's a couple years, I don't know what it is about 1995, but we've brought up so much in this episode.
Yeah.
1995, he won his first Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas. So you have an Academy Award winning
movie
actor that is capable of bringing the complexity to that character and has shown at that time that he can play villainous roles wild at heart. He can do comedy. Raising Arizona is a great example of that.
Wild,
can do crazy Vampire's Kiss. You know, he can just do these insane roles, but that he can also do these big action sequences. You know, we're talking
The Rock, stuff like
The
that.
Rock, Con Air, Face Off. I mean, like, all of these movies were coming in, and just like Nicolas Cage, every role that he was taking on was just these complex characters. And what is more complex than Superman?
Right.
And that's one of the things that I feel like, as far as big screen adaptations, with the exception of Man of Steel and even BVS to an extent, we've never seen that identity journey complexity of Superman ever take on the silver screen.
Yeah, I was going to say, on the silver screen, you're absolutely right. There has been a bit more exploration of that on television, which maybe this is a different topic. I personally think that if you're going from one serialized medium to another, i.e. comic books to the screen, I personally think this kind of thing is just better handled on television than in movies. But anyway, you're right. Nick Cage is just so, like, he's so vast. You know, he's so vast and has such a big, like, repertoire, and people don't really give him credit because Because he definitely has had some flops, and even some of his movies that aren't flops are just sort of obnoxious. And I think people view him as like, instead of owning a role, he's almost like a caricature of a role because he's a lot more over top than maybe they'd prefer. But I don't understand why people don't view like Christopher Walken that way, because to me, Christopher Walken has that same sort of real over the top feel. You know, you can't escape Nick Cage being Nick Cage, and you can't escape Christopher Walken being Christopher Walken.
Sure. I mean, when you're watching a lot of these screen tests and just a lot of the way that he is so passionate about Superman as a character.
That is very true.
And that's another thing, too, that makes him the perfect candidate, is that one of the first things that he ever purchased, I believe, in his career when he kind of like quote unquote hit it big was a copy of Action Comics #1. And it's in like...
He sold it, actually.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. Did you know how much he sold it for?
I don't.
So it was Action Comics #1. It was the first printing, and it was CGC graded at a 9.8.
I thought I knew that.
Yeah, he sold it on eBay for $3 million.
Yeah.
A comic book.
Yeah. But I mean,
for a lot of people, $3 million is retirement. You know, like.
Yeah, but I mean, like that's the audacity that he has something of that quality.
Yeah.
That old, in that great of condition, shows how much of a hardcore fan that he is.
He really is. And honestly, it's kind of one of those things where it's like he deserves the part.
So one of the things that I want to bring up in more modern times is Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool.
Okay.
Is
interesting.
Here you have a guy that has lobbied since 2008, 2009 to play this character and to bring this character justice.
Yeah.
And so finally, 2015, we get word that Fox is officially greenlighting a hard R Deadpool sequel or Deadpool spinoff film, and it is legitimately one of the best X-Men movies we've ever gotten.
Yeah.
And that's because Reynolds is a passionate person.
Yeah.
And even though like Deadpool 2, it's not as great, like he worked very closely with those writers to bring a story that was going to be something that he was going to be passionate about. And I feel like you would have had the same thing here with Nicolas Cage. When you watch the screen test of him interacting with the costume designers, with the special effects people, with Tim Burton, he is passionate about wanting to get this right.
Yeah. He's making more like informed comments than anybody else in the room, you know, when they're going through a lot of those. Kind of going from that, it did take Ryan Reynolds some time, but he did lobby for many years and got the part he wanted and knocked it out of the park, and it's been amazing. It has been considerably longer than it took Ryan Reynolds. But do you think that there is any potential still for Nicolas Cage as Superman? I mean, I know he hasn't really been lobbying for it, but what do you think?
I think yes. Okay. And I think Nicolas Cage is starting to make a comeback.
Oh yeah, hardcore.
I think you put films like Mandy and Color Out of Space in his career, and the fact that for like 8 months, I think it was, until it got a like national release date, Mandy held like either a 95 to 100% Rotten Tomatoes. Yeah. Something that Nicolas Cage hadn't been able to do in years in his career. And then you have Color Out of Space, which was equally well received this year. He has the upcoming Tiger King series, which people are just freaking out about. And then he's also, I believe, making the return to like a nationwide theaters next year, instead of just kind of doing these direct to video like weird sci-fi horror action movies that he's been doing for the last 10 years or so with I'm probably going to butcher this title, the Massive... I can't. It's basically he plays like it's like being John Malkovich, but with Nicolas Cage. Anyways,
all right.
So but again, he's starting to make a comeback, and there are all of these rumors now with Flashpoint. You have Michael Keaton coming back as Batman. You have Ben Affleck coming back as Batman.
Yeah.
So my thought is, you can finally bring Nicolas Cage in as
a
Superman.
Yeah.
And we almost got it earlier this year with Crisis on Infinite Earths over at the CW. They offered Nicolas Cage, and they just couldn't get the actual... they couldn't get it to work out schedule-wise. That's why Brandon Routh ended up taking up the cape and the cape again.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, I mean, the fact that this year we almost got it, or last year we almost got it, is, I mean, to me, that's enough to keep believing and keep hoping for it. But yeah, I mean, with Keaton returning, I mean, Keaton is Burton's Batman, you know, so something I have thought about, and like we talked about this, well, sort of mentioned it briefly earlier, is like, what if you did a Batman Beyond movie? You know, and you had some new whatever whippersnapper play Terry McGinnis, you know, Batman. And he could be however young you need him to be, which I always put Terry McGinnis right around like 23 to 25 maybe. Maybe not even that old. And you know, you have Batman, and he is capable as an Oracle type character, you know, as like a computer guy in Alfred. But he is not otherwise, and he is, you know, retired. You know, there was episodes absolutely in Batman Beyond where there was a Justice League Beyond, and Justice League Beyond still included Clark Kent Superman. You know, and so like, what if we had you could even like, what if it's a Tim Burton Batman Beyond film, or even we'll go full blown, and what if it's a Justice League Beyond film, and we have, you know, Keaton as Batman, retired, and Nick Cage as an older black suit wearing Superman. That would be the fact that he wears a black suit in the show is super cool, but it'd also be a really great way to throw back like the movie that he didn't get to make.
I think to a degree, when you're looking at directors, Tim Burton has a very unique gothic style.
Yeah.
Equally, Andy Muschietti, who is playing or is directing the upcoming Flashpoint movie, directed the last two It movies that we got. Mm. Also, very distinctly coming from a horror background, has that gothic aesthetic already.
Yeah.
So you could definitely make that work really well.
Yeah.
With bringing him into the Flashpoint movie, just because it's kind of already something that
it's already in the works.
It's already in the works.
Sure.
Fingers crossed that, you know, that it doesn't happen. It doesn't change again, because we've gone through like 8 or 9 directors at this point, like a handful of writers.
I think it's fine. Honestly, I think that movie's safe just because Ezra Miller wants it so bad. But yeah, it is kind of fingers crossed.
And so, I mean, I really hope that we get to see that. I mean, I feel like you know, DC's kind of at this point now, Warner Brothers more, because with the Snyder Cut, they're now also teasing a Deathstroke versus Batman miniseries for HBO Max. You're talking, you know, we just got news a day we're recording this of Jared Leto's Joker coming back for the Snyder Cut. You're getting all of these things that you never thought were going to happen. So I feel like at this point, given how it's going to be responded to, how we respond to, you know, everything as far as like all of these things we've been asking for years, there's still a good chance now that we could in fact see a Nicolas Cage Superman live action version, because we did technically get a Superman, Nicolas Cage, and Teen Titans Go to the Movies.
Go to the movies! Dude, yeah.
So, final thoughts about this documentary, though.
It's something. If you're a Nick Cage fan, you might like it. If you're a Superman fan, I really, really would recommend it. It is just, I mean, it's got a couple of comic book writers in there, and they even brought in, I remember something that I wanted to mention too, it was really cool, is they actually, for a concept artist for the film, one of the guys they brought in was a guy who had actually worked on Superman comic books. And yeah, that kind of thing is super, super cool to me, and it's great. It's really interesting look into just like how a movie, really any movie, can end up in development hell and be canceled, which unfortunately happens way too often. And I think like I myself really wonder why. And this was a really cool eye opener as to like, hey, like this is why this can happen.
So we might be exploring this a little bit further in future episodes.
Okay.
For whatever,
Sure.
Or just its creative differences, the idea of movies coming close to production and then failing right before, because this was 3 weeks out from production. Like that's another thing we didn't really even touch on.
Sure.
It's very close to the start date. So you go through all this pre-production, and right as you're getting ready to step into actual production, the plug gets pulled. But so ideas like this, like there's films that I could probably spend an entire another podcast talking about. And I think that this is I'm going to go one further. I think that this is a film that you need to check out, not just from a superhero standpoint, but also a filmmaking standpoint. Like if you're just a fan of the medium of movies,
for sure,
this is a fascinating documentary to look at.
Yeah, for sure. I also think it can kind of gave me an idea of like sometimes the movies that get made or that almost get made, sometimes they get made by the right people, and that's really awesome. I think Marvel has handled a lot of their properties that they didn't really, they didn't write. They've handled them pretty well overall. Certainly not flawlessly, but like for the people in Marvel Studios to never have like been comic book writers or editors or things like that, to have done that good of a job has been awesome, but with this movie, that was something that was really kind of like nail biting, is like you're making a movie about a property that you've never had any hand in, and it shows, and that's something that was really like really revealing and
devastating too.
Yeah, really kind of devastating, and really kind of one of those things where it's like, sometimes it's cool to have a team of people working on a movie. Sometimes it's really great when you have one guy rallying for something, and that one guy is willing to see it through because he has a vision, and his vision is worth preserving. And I think that all too often that right there doesn't happen enough.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so on our Nicolas Cage scale, 0 to 5, what would you give this documentary?
Okay, so that's really interesting because like Nick piece and a hot topic, then he is like, he's not even really in the credits. They don't interview him, just, spoiler, sorry, but he never gets interviewed about it. So keeping that in mind, because this is the Cage Corner podcast and we want to talk primarily about Nicolas Cage, I would probably only give this movie like a 2.5, maybe a 3. Just because, like, I liked it. It was very, very interesting. There were parts that were even very compelling. But I don't know. I want more Nicolas Cage.
So I'm gonna give this. I'm gonna double yours and go a solid 5.
Really?
I love this movie.
All right.
I've seen this movie several times.
Okay.
And to think about what could have been also projects me of thinking, if this movie was successful, what would Tim Burton's career would it turn out like?
Ooh, that's a good point.
What would Nicolas Cage's career turn out like? How would this have impacted Chris Rock's career?
But, I got to be that guy. If it was unsuccessful, if it bombed, same question.
So here's something, too, is that right around this time, you also have another Nicolas Cage movie that not a lot of people remember, City of Angels.
Yeah, I never seen that.
That's where the Goo Goo Dolls song Iris comes from.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
that's also, you also have Academy Award winner Meg Ryan in that one.
Mm-hmm.
A year later, he turns around and does a Scorsese film that nobody remembers. It's a horror movie called Bring Out the Dead. And so like Nicolas Cage is like doing like a lot of experimental things around this time.
Sure.
So honestly, I don't think that we would have forgotten it. But I mean, even I would even take the route of, even if this film wasn't financially successful, it would have ended up in camp territory.
Yeah, that's something that I do, we do have to remember is that, like, hey, a movie might not be financially successful, but it might earn itself a cult following later on. That's very, very much happens.
Batman and Robin.
Sure. Terrible film. Good Lord.
All right. All right. Well, you guys can find our mother show Victims and Villains everywhere at Victims and Villains, or go to victimsandvillains.net where you guys will find more information about this episode, other podcasts that we have done, and most importantly, suicide prevention resources. So until next time, remember to keep caging.